The sun over the Arizona territory was not a friend. It was a hammer, beating down on the cracked earth until the dust itself seemed to glow with a malevolent heat. It baked the life from the land, leaving behind a palette of brown and bone white, broken only by the stubborn green of creosote and the spiny arms of saguaros reaching for a sky that offered no mercy. The wind, when it came, was no relief. It was a hot breath that scoured the plains, carrying grit that stung the eyes and coated the back of the throat. This was a land of endurance, not of plenty. On the Granger homestead, every day was a battle against this unforgiving world. The farm was little more than a scar on the vast landscape, a collection of weathered buildings clinging to a patch of ground that had long since forgotten the meaning of a gentle rain. Eleanor Granger, known to everyone as Ellie, felt the heat seep into her bones as she worked. At 22, her hands were calloused, her face tanned and freckled by the constant sun, and her calico dress was faded to the color of the dust that surrounded her. The dreams she might have once held of a softer life had dried up along with the creek bed, leaving only the hard reality of survival. She worked beside her father, Thomas Granger, a man who seemed to be weathering away with his farm. His shoulders, once broad enough to carry the weight of any hardship, were now stooped. A cough rattled in his chest, a dry, rasping sound that echoed the rustle of brittle leaves. He had buried his wife in this ground 5 years ago, and Ellie often thought a part of him had been buried with her. Now, he fought to keep the rest from being swallowed by the dust. For Ellie's sake. "The well is low again. Pa," Ellie said, her voice steady as she tipped the last bucket of murky water into the trough for their 2 remaining horses. They were lean animals, their ribs showing like ripples in a pond, but they were strong. They had to be. Thomas leaned against a fence post, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of a trembling hand. "It will rain," he said, the words more a prayer than a prediction. "It has to." They had lost most of their cattle to the drought, selling them off one by one for pennies on the dollar just to buy flour and salt. What remained were a half-dozen scrawny cows and the 2 horses, their entire fortune. They were the reason the fence needed constant mending, the reason Ellie slept with a shotgun near her bed. In a land this sparse, desperate men did desperate things. The first sign of trouble was not a sound, but a feeling, a prickling on the back of her neck. The air grew still. The cicadas ceased their droning song. The horses lifted their heads from the trough, ears swiveling, nostrils flaring. Ellie followed their gaze toward the low-slung mesas that bordered their property. A plume of dust rose against the brassy sky, too deliberate for the wind, too large for a single rider. "Pa," she said softly, her hand going to the worn handle of the axe leaning against the barn wall. Thomas had seen it too. He straightened up, the weariness in his face replaced by a familiar, grim resolve. "Get inside. Ellie, bar the door." "I am not leaving you out here," she stated, her jaw set. She was her father's daughter, stubborn as the rocky soil they tried to till. There were 4 of them, emerging from the heat haze like apparitions. They were hard-looking men, their faces obscured by grime and overgrown beards, their clothes ragged. They rode with a lazy confidence that was more menacing than any outright threat, their eyes scanning the meager homestead with a predatory gleam. They were not here to pay a social call. The lead rider, a big man with a greasy leather hat, reined in his horse a dozen yards from the barn. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "That's a fine pair of horses you got there, old man," he drawled, his voice grating. "Looks like they could use a better pasture." Thomas Granger stood his ground, his hand resting on the fence rail. He was pale, but his voice did not waver. "This is private property. State your business or ride on." The man chuckled, a low, ugly sound. He and his companions dismounted, moving with a coordinated purpose that spoke of long practice. "Our business is with them horses, and the cattle, if you ain't too attached." "You are not taking anything," Ellie said, her voice ringing out sharper than she expected. She raised the axe, holding it like a rifle. The men laughed. The leader's eyes, small and dark, settled on her. "Look at that, boys, a little fire cat. Maybe we'll take her too." That was when Thomas moved. He lunged for the shotgun he kept propped just inside the barn door, his old body moving with a surprising speed born of desperation. But he was not fast enough. One of the other men, wiry and quick, slammed the butt of his rifle into Thomas's side. The old man gasped, a choked cry of pain, and crumpled to the ground. A scream tore from Ellie's throat, raw and full of fury. She ran toward her father, the axe forgotten, but the big man caught her by the arm. His grip was like iron. Now, little cat," he sneered, his breath hot and foul against her cheek. "Do not be hasty." Chaos erupted. The other two men were already herding the panicked cows out of their small corral. Gunshots suddenly split the air, but they were not from the outlaws' guns. The sound was sharp, precise, coming from the rocky outcrop that overlooked the farm. The wiry man who had struck her father yelped and dropped his rifle, clutching a hand that was suddenly slick with blood. Another shot, and the hat flew from the head of a second man, who scrambled for cover with a terrified curse. The big man holding Ellie stiffened, his head whipping around, searching for the source of the attack. He shoved her away, pulling his own pistol. "Who's out there?" he roared. "Show yourself!" The answer was not a voice, but a figure, moving with a fluid silence that seemed impossible. He descended from the rocks not like a man, but like a shadow detaching itself from the stone. He was tall and lean, dressed in buckskin leggings and a simple tunic. His long, black hair was held back by a leather band. He was Apache in his hands. He held an army-issue rifle, and he used it with an unnerving economy of motion. The outlaws, who had been so confident moments before, were now caught in a deadly trap. They fired wildly toward the rocks, their bullets whining and ricocheting. The Apache man did not waste his shots. He moved from one piece of cover to the next, firing, reloading, and firing again. Another outlaw cried out, clutching his leg as he fell. The leader, his face a mask of rage and fear, turned his attention back to the Grangers. If he could not have the livestock, he would have his revenge. He raised his pistol, aiming it at Thomas, who was struggling to get to his feet. Ellie saw it happen as if time had slowed. The dark hole of the pistol's barrel, the cruel twist of the man's mouth, the helpless look in her father's eyes. She threw herself in front of him, a human shield. But the shot never came. The Apache man was suddenly there, between them. He had closed the distance with no sound, a phantom of the dry earth. He did not use his rifle. A long knife was in his hand. The fight was short, brutal, and silent. There was a desperate grunt from the outlaw, a flash of steel, and then the big man fell to his knees, his eyes wide with disbelief, before toppling face first into the dust. The remaining two thieves, seeing their leader fall, did not wait for a similar fate. They scrambled onto their horses and fled, galloping back into the shimmering heat from which they had come, leaving their wounded companion behind. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the whimpering of the injured outlaw and the ragged sound of Ellie's own breathing. She was on her knees, her hands covering her mouth, her body trembling uncontrollably. The Apache man stood over the body of the man he had killed, his chest rising and falling. There was a long, bloody gash on his arm, and a smear of dirt and blood across his cheek. He looked not triumphant, but weary, as if a great weight had settled upon him. He turned his head slowly, and his eyes met Ellie's. They were dark eyes, deep and unreadable, but they were not cold. In their depths, she saw a flicker of something she could not name, a pain so profound it seemed ancient, a loneliness that mirrored the vast, empty landscape around them. It was a haunted expression, the look of a man who had witnessed the end of his own world. The moment stretched, a silent exchange that seemed to last an eternity. He saw her, not as a farmer's daughter, not as a white woman, but as a person, terrified and trembling in the dirt. And she saw him, a solitary warrior, bloodied and alone. Then, as quickly as it had come, the connection was broken. He turned his gaze to her father, who was now propped on one elbow, groaning in pain. The Apache man gave a single, sharp nod, as if acknowledging a debt paid or a duty done. Without another look, he walked over to the outlaw who was still whimpering on the ground, disarmed him, and with a quiet word in his own tongue that sounded like a command, gestured for him to leave. The man scrambled to his feet, clutching his wounded hand, and limped away into the wilderness. The Apache man did not take the outlaw's gun. He did not touch the money pouch on the dead man's belt. He simply turned and walked back toward the rocks, his form blurring into the landscape until he was gone, vanishing as silently as he had appeared. It was only when the last trace of him had disappeared that Ellie was able to move. She rushed to her father's side. "Pa, are you all right? Where are you hurt?" "My ribs," Thomas gasped, his face ashen with pain. "He broke my ribs. I think—" He coughed, and a fleck of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Ellie's shock. "We have to get you inside," she said, her voice shaking. With great effort, she helped him to his feet and half-carried, half-dragged him into the small, stifling farmhouse, laying him gently on his bed. The townsfolk arrived an hour later, a posse led by Sheriff Brody. They had seen the dust from the fleeing riders and had come to investigate. Brody was a man whose authority came more from the tin star on his vest than from any inherent strength of character. He was flanked by several local ranchers, men whose faces were set in permanent scowls and whose opinions on Native Americans were well known and ugly. They surveyed the scene, the body in the dust, the bloodstains, the splintered corral fence, with grim satisfaction. "Looks like you had some trouble, Granger," Sheriff Brody said, stepping into the dim farmhouse. His eyes flicked from the pale face of Thomas on the bed to Ellie, who stood protectively beside him. "They tried to steal our livestock," Ellie explained, her voice tight. "They hurt my father." "I see that," Brody said, his gaze lingering on the dead man outside. "Who did this?" "It was an Apache man," Ellie said. "He was camping nearby. He saved us. He drove them off." The sheriff exchanged a look with one of the ranchers, a man named Silas. A knowing, cynical smirk passed between them. "An Apache, you say?" Brody's tone was laced with disbelief. "And he just happened to be here? Drove them off and didn't take anything for himself? Not a horse? Not a gun?" "He did not take anything," Ellie insisted, her anger rising. "He saved our lives." Silas snorted from the doorway. "More likely he was in on it with them. Probably had a falling out over the spoils. You cannot trust any of them." "That is not what happened," Ellie shot back, her hands clenched into fists. "I was here. I saw it." Sheriff Brody held up a hand, a gesture of false patience. "Now, Miss Granger, you have had a fright. Things can get confused in the heat of the moment. It is a known fact that Apaches raid homesteads. Maybe he scared off this bunch so he could come back later and take the spoils for himself. We will form a party and hunt him down, for your own safety." Of course. The injustice of it stole her breath. This man, this stranger, had risked his life for them, had bled for them, and these men were talking about hunting him like an animal. They had arrived too late to help, but just in time to pass judgment. They saw only what they wanted to see, what their prejudice had already decided was the truth. "You will do no such thing," she said, her voice low and fierce. "You will leave him be. He is the only reason my father and I are still alive." The sheriff looked at her with a condescending pity, as if she were a hysterical child. "We will handle it from here. Miss, you just tend to your father." He and his men left, their boots heavy on the porch boards. their murmurs carrying on the hot air, words of suspicion and contempt. Ellie stood in the doorway and watched them haul away the body of the outlaw, feeling a profound and terrifying sense of isolation. The world she had known, with its simple lines of right and wrong, had become a tangled, dangerous place. The expression in the Apache man's eyes came back to her then, that deep and sorrowful knowledge. For the first time, she felt she was beginning to understand it. Days passed in a haze of worry and work. Ellie tended to her father, whose condition worsened. The doctor from town came once, charged them a small fortune, and confirmed that 2 of his ribs were broken and his lung was bruised. He left a bottle of laudanum for the pain and offered little hope beyond rest and prayer. Ellie did the work of 2 people, her body aching with fatigue, but her mind was elsewhere. She found herself scanning the rocky mesas, watching the horizon, half hoping and half fearing she would see the silent figure again. The memory of his eyes, haunted and intense, lingered in her thoughts, a question she could not answer. Then, one evening, as the sun bled red and orange across the sky, he was there. She had been mending the broken section of the corral fence, her fingers clumsy with exhaustion. When she sensed a presence behind her, she turned, her heart leaping into her throat, to find him standing a few feet away. He moved with such quiet that the dust itself did not seem to stir. He carried a small bundle of leaves and roots in one hand. He did not speak, but looked past her, toward the house where her father lay. His arm was bandaged with a strip of clean-looking hide. Understanding dawned on her. He had come back to check on the man he had saved. Hesitantly, she stepped aside. "He is inside," she whispered. Nantan, for that was his name, though she did not know it yet, nodded once and walked past her. He entered the small home without invitation, but with a strange sense of belonging. Ellie followed, watching as he knelt by her father's bedside. He looked at Thomas, his expression unreadable, then opened his hand, showing her the herbs. He made a gesture of crushing them and mixing them with water, then pointing to his own chest, indicating they were for breathing. For the next hour, he worked in silence. He did not ask for anything. When he saw her struggling with a loose fence post, he went outside and, with a strength that seemed effortless, reset it. Securing it with rawhide bindings he produced from a pouch at his waist. He checked the water in the trough, his movements efficient and purposeful. He was offering silent aid, a language of action that needed no words. When he was done, he prepared to leave as silently as he had come. But as he reached the doorway, Thomas's weak voice called out from the bed. "Wait!" Nantan paused, turning his head. Thomas struggled to prop himself up on his elbows, his face etched with pain and a powerful resolve. He looked from the Apache to his daughter, his gaze clear and sharp. "Ellie, come here." She moved to his bedside, her heart pounding with an unknown dread. Her father took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. His eyes were fixed on Nantan, who stood silhouetted against the dying light. "That man," Thomas said, his voice raspy but firm, "saved our farm. He saved our lives. He asked for nothing in return. A man like that does not ask for anything." He paused, gathering his strength, his gaze unwavering. "So, we will give him what no gold could buy." A cold knot of apprehension tightened in Ellie's stomach. She did not understand what her father meant, but his tone filled her with a terrible fear. The air in the small room grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. Thomas Granger looked at his daughter, his eyes full of love, pain, and a grim certainty. "You will marry him, Ellie." The words fell into the silence, hard and absolute, like stones dropped into a deep well. Ellie stared at her father, her mind reeling, unable to process what he had said. Marry him? Marry this stranger? This silent, wild man who was a ghost in his own land? A man the town wanted to hunt down? The world tilted, the floor seeming to drop away beneath her. She opened her mouth to protest, to scream, to argue. But no sound came out. She could only stare, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. She looked at Nantan. He had not moved. His face was impassive, giving no hint of his thoughts. He simply watched them, a silent observer to a decision that would bind his life to hers. Ellie said nothing. There was nothing to say. In her father's eyes, she saw that the decision had already been made. It was not a request. It was a final, binding payment of a debt he believed could be settled in no other way. The silence that followed her father's declaration was a living thing, vast and suffocating. It pressed in on Ellie, stealing the air from her lungs. For a long moment, she could only stare at him, the words echoing in her mind, nonsensical and monstrous. Marry him? The two words were a brand, searing a future she could not comprehend onto her skin. No, she finally managed to whisper, the sound a dry rustle in her throat. Pa, no, you cannot be serious. Thomas Granger's face, already pale with pain, hardened with a resolve that frightened her more than any anger. I have never been more serious in my life. Eleanor, that man stood between us and death. A debt like that is not paid with a sack of coin or a handful of cattle. It is a debt of blood, a debt of life. But to marry him? Her voice rose, laced with a hysteria she fought to control. He is a stranger. He is an Indian. The town, they will crucify us. They already look at us with suspicion. Let them look, her father rasped, a cough shaking his frail frame. Their whispers did not stop the bullets, did they? Their judgment did not pull me from the dirt. He did. I am not long for this world. Ellie, I feel it in my bones. This cough, this weakness, it is eating me from the inside out. When I am gone, who will protect you? The sheriff. Who thinks you are a liar? Caleb, with his soft hands and loud talk? No, you will be alone. A woman on a failing farm. A target. This man, he is a warrior. With him, you will be safe. Tears of frustration and fear stung her eyes. This is not about safety. It is about honor. Your honor. You are sacrificing me to settle a debt. I am sacrificing nothing, he said, his voice dangerously low. I am giving you a future, a protector. It is a hard path. I do not deny it. But our life has always been hard. This is just a different kind of hard. My mind is made up. She argued, pleaded, and reasoned, her words tumbling over one another in a desperate torrent. She spoke of their differences, of the chasm of culture and language that lay between them. She spoke of the hatred in the town, of the life of isolation she would be forced to lead. He listened, his eyes closed, his face a grim mask. He did not yield. He believed he was doing the only right and honorable thing a father could do. He was repaying a debt and securing his daughter's life in a single, terrible act. Defeated. Ellie fell silent, the weight of his unbending will crushing her spirit. She felt like a pawn in a game she had never agreed to play, her life no longer her own. The next afternoon, she went looking for him. She did not know his name, did not know where he went when he melted back into the landscape. She simply walked, following a faint game trail that led toward the jagged maw of a nearby canyon. The sun was hot on her shoulders, the air still and heavy. She found him in a small, sheltered cove, tucked into the red rock. He was building a fire, not a large, crackling blaze, but a small, neat construction of twigs that produced almost no smoke. He moved with a quiet efficiency, each action deliberate and without waste. He did not seem surprised to see her. He looked up as she approached, his dark eyes following her, and then returned to his task. He did not speak. The silence was hers to fill. She stood a few feet away, twisting the fabric of her apron in her hands. How did one say such a thing? How did one offer oneself up like a piece of property? My father, she began, her voice unsteady. He is grateful for what you did. Nantan placed a final piece of wood on the nascent fire and looked at her. His face was impassive, giving away nothing. "He believes a great debt is owed," she continued, forcing the words out. "He wants to repay it. He told me that I am to marry you." She said it flatly, a statement of fact, a message delivered. She braced herself for his reaction. Disbelief, perhaps, anger, laughter, even at the absurdity of it. She half prayed he would refuse, that he would see the madness in her father's command and release her from it. Nantan did none of those things. He remained silent for a long time, his gaze not on her, but on the small flame that had just begun to lick at the dry wood. The silence stretched, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the canyon. He seemed to be considering her words not as a proposal, but as a piece of information, like a change in the weather or the track of a deer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even, without any discernible emotion. "If it is your wish." Ellie stared at him, thrown completely off balance. It was not a question. It was not an acceptance. It was a statement of acquiescence, placing the entire weight of the decision back onto her shoulders. But it was not her wish. It was her father's command. Yet, in that moment, she understood that her protest was meaningless. Her father would not relent, and this man would not refuse. She was caught between two immovable stones. "It is what my father has decided," she said, her voice hollow. He simply nodded, as if that settled the matter. The wedding took place 3 days later. It was a bleak, hurried affair. The preacher, a nervous man named Reverend Michael, came out from town, his Bible clutched in his sweaty hands. He kept glancing at Nantan as if he expected him to produce a tomahawk at any moment. The witnesses were 2 of their nearest neighbors, the Millers, a grim-faced couple who stood stiffly by the porch, their disapproval radiating from them like heat from a stove. Ellie wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that her mother had made for her years ago. It felt like a costume for a place she had no wish to be in. Nantan stood beside her, silent and still. He wore the same buckskin leggings and tunic, clean but unadorned. He looked not like a groom, but like a captive, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the horizon as if looking for an escape route. Reverend Michael stumbled through the words, his voice thin and reedy in the vast emptiness of the landscape. When he pronounced them man and wife, the silence that followed was more profound than any celebration. "Mr." Miller grunted and signed the marriage certificate thrust at him by the preacher. His wife did the same, her lips a thin, white line, when the preacher timidly suggested that Nantan might also make his mark. Ellie's new husband simply dipped his finger in the inkwell and pressed a perfect world thumbprint onto the paper. As the Millers turned to leave, Ellie's father, propped up in a chair on the porch, extended a trembling hand. "Thank you for coming, John." John Miller shook his hand briefly. Then, his duty done, he and his wife walked away without a word or a glance for Ellie or Nantan. The preacher, eager to depart, offered a final, flustered prayer and practically ran to his buggy. Nantan had not offered to shake anyone's hand, and no one had offered him theirs. The union was sealed, not with a kiss or a celebration, but with the cold weight of social exile. Word spread through the territory like a brush fire. The story, twisted and embellished with each telling, became a sordid tale of a desperate old man selling his daughter to a savage. Ellie became a pariah. When she rode into town for supplies, conversation ceased as she entered the general store. Women would pull their children close, gathering their skirts as if to avoid contamination. Men would stare, their eyes a mixture of pity and contempt. She was no longer Ellie Granger, the quiet farmer's daughter. She was the Indian's wife. The name was whispered behind cupped hands, a brand of shame she could feel on her skin. One afternoon, as she was loading sacks of flour into her wagon, a voice she once cherished called her name. "Ellie!" She turned to see Caleb Vance standing there. He was the son of a prosperous rancher, a handsome man with a confident smile she had once found charming. They had been courting, in a slow, respectable sort of way, before the drought had consumed all of her time and energy. Now, his smile was gone, replaced by a bitter sneer. "Is it true?" he demanded, his voice loud enough for the onlookers to hear. "What they are saying, that you married him?" "Hello, Caleb," she said quietly, refusing to be drawn into a public spectacle. "I have to get back. My father is not well." He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. His face was flushed with anger and whiskey. "Do not walk away from me. I thought we had an understanding. I was going to speak to your father." "Things have changed, Caleb," she said, trying to move around him. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Changed? You call throwing yourself away on a redskin changed? Have you lost your mind, or did your father sell you that cheap?" His words were a slap in the face. Hot shame and cold anger warred within her. "Let go of me," she said through clenched teeth. "Not until you explain yourself," he snarled, pulling her closer. "What is it like, Ellie? Lying with a savage?" Before she could answer, a shadow fell over them. Nantan was there. He had come into town with her, a silent escort who had remained with the horses. But he had materialized at her side as if from the very air. He did not speak. He did not raise his hand. He simply stood between her and Caleb and looked at him. His stillness was more terrifying than any threat. The easy confidence drained from Caleb's face, replaced by a primal fear. He was looking at a man who did not fight by the town's rules of drunken brawls and posturing. He was looking at a predator. Caleb released her arm as if it had burned him, his bravado crumbling into a weak bluster. "This is not over," he spat, backing away. He cast one last look of disgust at Ellie before turning and storming off down the street. Nantan's eyes followed him until he was gone. Then he looked at Ellie, his gaze falling to the red marks on her arm where Caleb's fingers had been. A muscle twitched in his jaw, the only sign of the fury he held in check. He said nothing. He simply picked up the last sack of flour, placed it in the wagon, and helped her onto the seat. The ride home was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. She had been publicly claimed and publicly defended. She was his wife. The thought sent a shiver through her that was not entirely from fear. In the weeks that followed, Ellie began to see the man, not the myth. Nantan moved into the small, dusty room that had once been her mother's, while she remained in her own. He was a ghost in her house, a silent presence at the edges of her life. She began to notice how he lived. He slept lightly, startling awake at the slightest sound, the creak of a floorboard, the cry of a distant coyote. When he sat, it was always with his back to a wall, his eyes on the door. He never seemed to be fully at rest, his body coiled with a tension that spoke of years spent in constant peril. He was a man scarred by violence. She saw the faint, pale lines of old wounds on his arms and back when he worked without a shirt in the punishing heat. She saw the haunted look that came into his eyes when he stared too long at the setting sun. He was a man in tune with the world around him. He could read the sky, predict the wind, and find water where Ellie saw only parched earth. He moved with a grace and purpose that made the clumsy movements of the townsfolk seem foolish. He cared for her father with a quiet diligence. He would brew the herbal remedies he gathered from the hills, patiently helping the old man drink the bitter liquid. He would change the dressings on Thomas's bruised ribs, his large hands surprisingly gentle. He tended to the animals first every morning, feeding the horses and the remaining cattle before he would take a piece of bread for himself. He was a man of profound discipline and deeper sorrow. One night, the sky broke. The rain they had prayed for came not as a gentle blessing, but as a violent assault. The wind howled, rattling the window panes, and the sky was ripped open by jagged slashes of lightning. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion that shook the small house to its foundations. Ellie had been in the main room, trying to read by the flickering lamplight. Nantan was in his room, the door closed. At the violent clap of thunder, she jumped, her heart hammering against her ribs. It sounded like a cannon shot, a blast of artillery that vibrated through the very floorboards. From Nantan's room, there was a sudden, sharp cry, quickly stifled, followed by the sound of something heavy falling. Worried, Ellie got up and pushed open his door. The room was dark, lit only by the strobing flashes of lightning from the small window. In that stark, intermittent light, she saw him. He was not standing. He was on the floor, on his knees, his hands pressed against his ears. His head was bowed, his body rigid with a terror so absolute it seemed to have stolen his breath. Another crack of thunder, louder this time, shook the house. Nantan flinched violently, a choked sob escaping his lips. He was not the silent, stoic warrior she had come to know. He was a man broken by a memory, reliving a horror she could not imagine. She saw his shoulders begin to shake. He was crying, but without a sound, a deep, silent agony that was more terrible than any scream. He began to whisper, the words a torrent of guttural sounds in his own language, the language of his lost people, of his pain. For a moment, Ellie stood frozen in the doorway, an intruder on a grief too private and profound to witness. Every instinct told her to retreat, to give him his privacy. But she could not. The sight of his raw, unguarded suffering moved something deep within her. He was not a savage, not a stranger, but a man drowning in the darkness of his own mind. Slowly, she walked into the room and knelt on the floor in front of him. She did not know what to say. English words would be useless, and she had no words of comfort in his tongue. So she did the only thing she could. She reached out a hesitant hand and placed it on his shoulder. The effect was instantaneous. His whispered words ceased. The rigid tension in his body seemed to lessen by a fraction. He did not look up, but he leaned into her touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement. It was the first time they had ever truly touched, not as a transaction, not as a duty, but as two people, alone in a storm. It was a touch of quiet, human connection, offered without expectation, and received in silent gratitude. She did not pull her hand away. As the storm raged outside, she moved closer, curling up beside him on the hard wooden floor. She rested her head against his chest, feeling the frantic, frightened beat of his heart beneath her ear. He remained still, his breathing ragged, but he did not push her away. The rain slammed against the tin roof, a relentless, drumming rhythm. But inside the small, dark room, a fragile peace began to settle. They stayed like that for a long time, two lonely souls finding a sliver of shelter in each other, bruised and broken, but for the first time, not entirely alone. The night of the storm changed something between them. The physical barrier of their separate rooms remained, but an invisible wall had crumbled. The silence that now stretched between Ellie and Nantan was no longer purely awkward. It was weighted with the memory of shared vulnerability, a fragile truce born in darkness and thunder. Time, measured by the relentless rise and fall of the Arizona sun, began to pass in a new rhythm. Nantan, without a word of discussion, began to weave himself into the fabric of the farm's survival. He did not ask for permission. He simply saw what was broken and fixed it. Ellie would wake to the sound of a hammer striking true and find him on the roof of the barn, replacing shingles torn loose by the wind. She would see him in the midday heat, resetting fence posts with a strength that made the hard work look easy, his muscles moving with fluid power under his tanned skin. He cleared the silt from the well, reinforced the walls, and rigged a new pulley system that made drawing water less of a back-breaking chore. He worked with a quiet, ceaseless energy, as if the physical labor was the only thing that could keep the ghosts at bay. Ellie worked beside him. At first, she felt like an observer in her own life, watching this silent man shore up the ruins of her world. But slowly, she began to participate. She would bring him water without him having to ask, anticipating his thirst. She would hand him tools, learning their names and purposes under his brief, instructive gaze. They worked for hours in a silence that was companionable, a shared language of effort and purpose. The farm, which had been slowly dying under the weight of her father's illness and her own exhaustion, began to breathe again. The fences stood straight. The barn door no longer sagged on its hinges. The homestead felt less like a place of defeat and more like a place of defense. In the cool of the evenings, as they sat on the porch, a different kind of work began. Tentatively, Ellie started to chip away at the wall of his past. The questions were small at first, hesitant offerings into the quiet between them. "Did you always live in these hills?" she asked one evening, as the sky turned a deep, bruised purple. He was sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone the only sound. He did not look up. "No, my people lived by the great river, to the south." "Your family?" she ventured, her heart quickening. It felt like a trespass. The scraping stopped. He stared out at the darkening mesas for a long moment before he spoke, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "They are gone." The finality in his words was a door slamming shut, and she did not dare to knock on it again that night. But she tried again, days later, driven by a need to understand the source of the profound sadness in his eyes. "How did you learn to fight with a rifle like that? The soldiers, they teach that way." This time, a flicker of something dark and bitter crossed his face. "I was in a place for my people. The government called it a reservation." He paused, and the word he spoke next was filled with a quiet venom. "A prison camp." He offered no more details, but the image bloomed in her mind, stark and terrible. She pictured him behind fences, a man made for open spaces, caged like an animal. She began to understand that his scars were not only on his skin. His silence was not a choice, but a landscape, shaped by a loss so immense it had swallowed all his words. His haunted reaction to the thunder took on a new, horrifying clarity. She imagined the crack of cannons, the roar of army rifles, and felt a wave of sickness wash over her. Her growing understanding of his past began to fuel a slow-burning anger at the world that had created it. This anger found its voice in town. Before, she had endured the whispers and cold shoulders with downcast eyes and a burning in her cheeks. Now, she met their stares with a defiance that was new to her. She was in the general store, trying to purchase salt and a new shovel head, when Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, addressed her loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I am not sure I have enough to sell to you. Mrs. Granger, there is a shortage. You see, must save my stock for my regular customers." The lie was as plain as the sneer on his face. Two women standing nearby snickered behind their hands. In the past, Ellie would have mumbled an apology and fled. Today, she did not. She set her jaw and looked him directly in the eye. "My money is as good as anyone else's, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And my husband has done more to protect this valley than any man in this room. He saved my father's life when no one else was there to help. If that makes me an irregular customer, then I will take my business to another town. But know that you are refusing me, not because of who I am, but because you are a coward, afraid of a man you do not have the courage to understand." A shocked silence fell over the store. "Mr. Henderson's face turned a blotchy red. He sputtered, but could not form a coherent reply. Without another word, Ellie turned and walked out, her head held high. She did not know where the words had come from, but they felt true. They felt right. She was defending him, and in doing so, she was defending herself, defending the strange new life that had been forced upon her. The fragile stability of their lives was shattered one cool morning in late autumn. She went to wake her father, a cup of warm broth in her hand, and found him still. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful, the lines of pain finally smoothed away. He had not cried out, he had not struggled, He had simply slipped away in his sleep, his tired body finally giving up its long fight. A strange numbness enveloped Ellie. She stood there for a long time, the cup growing cold in her hands, unable to accept the finality of the silence in the room. This man, who had been the center of her entire world, the reason for all her toil and all her fear, was gone. And she was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The numbness gave way to a wave of grief so powerful it buckled her knees. She sank to the floor, the cup smashing beside her, and broke down, her sobs raw and ragged in the quiet house. She did not know how long she knelt there, weeping, but eventually, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Nantan. He did not speak. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply knelt beside her, a solid, silent presence in the midst of her desolation. When her tears had subsided into shuddering breaths, he helped her to her feet and led her out of the room, gently closing the door on her past. He took care of everything. He dug the grave himself, on a small rise overlooking the farm, next to the spot where her mother was buried. He chose the spot with care, where the morning sun would touch it first. He did not use a shovel from the barn. Instead, he used his hands and a flat piece of stone, digging into the hard earth with a patient, rhythmic determination. When it was done, he wrapped her father's body in a clean white sheet, the best one they owned, and carried him to the grave. Ellie stood by, hollow and empty, as he lowered the body into the earth. She had expected him to simply fill the hole, to finish the grim task, but he did not. He stood over the open grave, his head bowed, and he began to speak. The words were in his own language, a low, melodic chant that was not a prayer of supplication, but a song of guidance. It was a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself, a lament for a fellow warrior, a map for a spirit on a new journey. When he was finished, he placed a single eagle feather on her father's chest before he began to fill the grave. He worked until a neat mound of earth stood on the hillside, and then he marked it not with a cross, but with 4 smooth, flat stones, one for each of the cardinal directions. It was a burial of profound respect, a ceremony that honored her father in a way she never could have imagined. The days that followed his death were a blur of aching emptiness. The farm, which had seemed so full of purpose, was now just a collection of chores. The silence in the house was no longer companionable. It was a deafening roar of loss. Ellie moved through her days like a ghost, her grief a physical weight that made every task an immense effort. One night, rummaging through her father's old trunk, she found it, a half-full bottle of whiskey. Her father had been a temperate man, forbidding strong drink in the house, but he had kept this bottle for medicinal purposes that never seemed to arise. Ellie stared at it. In its amber depths, she saw a promise of numbness, a temporary escape from the pain that was clawing at her from the inside. She started drinking that night, sitting alone at the kitchen table, the raw spirit burning a path down her throat. It did not make the pain go away, but it blunted its edges, pushing it back just enough for her to breathe. Nantan watched her, his face unreadable, but he said nothing. He did not stop her as she drank herself into a stupor night after night, seeking oblivion in the bottom of the bottle. Then, one morning, she woke with a pounding headache and a foul taste in her mouth, her first thought of the whiskey that would dull the ache. She stumbled into the kitchen, but the bottle was not on the table. She saw Nantan outside, by the well. He had the bottle in his hand. As she watched, he uncorked it and slowly, deliberately, poured the remaining contents onto the thirsty ground. The dark liquid soaked into the dust and was gone. Something inside her snapped. A raw, screaming rage erupted from the depths of her grief and shame. She stormed out of the house, her bare feet kicking up dust. "What do you think you are doing?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "That was mine! Who gave you the right?" Nantan turned to face her. He did not speak. He simply held the empty bottle and looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a sorrow that mirrored her own. His silence was more enraging than any argument.
You have no right, she screamed.
Her fists clenched. She began to beat them against his chest, her blows weak and ineffectual against his solid frame.
You did this, all of it. My father is dead. My life is ruined. If you had never come here, none of this would have happened.
The words poured out of her, a torrent of poison she had held inside for months.
I am a disgrace. The whole territory whispers about me. The woman who married a savage. I have no one. I have nothing. I am alone. And it is your fault. You and your debt of honor. My father threw me away on you. And for what? For this empty, miserable life. I hate you. Do you hear me? I hate you.
She screamed until her throat was raw, sobbed until she had no tears left, and beat her fists against him until she had no strength. Through it all, he stood there, as still and unmovable as the mesas on the horizon. He took the blows. He took the words. He absorbed her rage and her pain, his face a mask of stone. When she was finally spent, she collapsed against him, her forehead resting on his chest, her body trembling with exhaustion. He did not hold her. He did not push her away. He simply stood there, a silent anchor in the storm of her despair. After a moment, he gently set her back from him. He looked at her one last time, his eyes holding an expression of profound and weary resignation. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, not toward the house, but toward the open country, his figure growing smaller and smaller until the landscape swallowed him whole. Days passed. The silence he left behind was a physical presence, a gaping wound in the fabric of her life. The farm was quiet again, but now the quiet was empty. There was no sound of his hammer, no sight of his steady, purposeful work. There was only the wind and the rattling of dry leaves and the crushing weight of her solitude. The rage had burned itself out, leaving behind the cold ashes of regret. She had driven him away, the one person who had stood by her, the one person who had seen the worst of her and had not flinched. She had blamed him for her loneliness. But now, in his absence, she understood a terrible truth. She had not been truly alone until this moment. She missed his quiet presence. She missed the unspoken companionship of their shared work. She missed the feeling of safety that his nearness had brought her, a feeling she had refused to acknowledge until it was gone. On the fourth day, she could bear it no longer. She had to find him. She had to tell him. She did not even know what. She only knew that the silence of his absence was more unbearable than the hardship of his presence. She walked for hours, following the trails she had seen him take. Heading toward the canyons, the sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and crimson. When she finally found him, he was in the same sheltered cove where she had gone to accept his hand in marriage. A small fire burned, and he was sitting beside it, carving a bow from a long, straight piece of juniper wood. Shavings lay in a pale circle around him as he worked the wood with a knife, his movements focused and graceful. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her heart pounding. He knew she was there. He had known the moment she came within 100 yards. But he did not look up. He continued his work, giving her the choice to speak or to leave. She took a deep breath and stepped into the firelight.
I do not hate you,
she said, her voice barely a whisper. The knife stilled. He slowly raised his head, his face half in shadow, half in the warm glow of the fire. His eyes searched hers, deep and solemn. I never hated you either, he replied, his voice soft. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of relief and a pain so deep she could not name it. She had thrown the worst of herself at him, and he had not thrown it back. She took another step closer, her body trembling with a desperate, terrifying vulnerability. All the barriers were down, all her pride stripped away, leaving only a raw and aching need.
Do you want me?
She asked, the words so quiet they were almost carried away by the evening breeze. Even now? He did not answer with words. He rose to his feet in a single, fluid motion, and closed the distance between them. He raised a hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, she saw not a warrior, not a stranger, but a man, as lonely and as wounded as she was. She saw a flicker of the same desperate need that was tearing her apart. Then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of duty or ownership. It was a kiss of deep, aching longing, tender and yet desperate, a raw and honest confession of a mutual hunger for comfort, for connection, for another human soul in the vast, uncaring wilderness. It was the taste of wood smoke and dust and a sorrow too deep for words. He pulled her against him, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had crumbled to dust. He lifted her into his arms and carried her to the soft bed of pine needles he had made for himself, laying her down gently under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the desert sky. There, in the quiet of the canyon, they came together, not as a white woman and an Apache man, but as two survivors, their bodies speaking a language of tenderness and need that required no translation, finding in each other a solace as raw and as real as the earth beneath them. They came back from the canyon not as two separate people, but as one. The small farmhouse, which had once felt cavernous with its two lonely occupants, now seemed rightly filled. Nantan moved his few belongings, a bedroll, his carving tools, a leather pouch of remedies, from the spare room into hers. That first night, they lay side by side in the narrow bed, not touching, the space between them electric with a fragile, unspoken truth. But in the middle of the night, a chill crept into the room, and Ellie woke to find his arm had fallen across her waist, his hand resting on her hip in a gesture of unconscious possession. She did not move it. She lay still, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. And for the first time since her father's death, she did not feel alone. Their fragile marriage, born of debt and forged in grief, began to feel real. Morning started with soft murmurs, their bodies still warm from sleep. He would rise before the sun, his movements silent so as not to wake her, but she always did. She would watch him through slitted eyes as he washed his face in the basin, the cool morning light tracing the lean muscles of his back. They shared meals at the small kitchen table, the silence no longer awkward, but comfortable, punctuated by the simple sounds of living, the scrape of a fork on a plate, the soft clink of a cup. A new language grew between them, woven from two different worlds. He began to teach her his words. Sitting on the porch steps as dusk settled, he would point to the sky. "Yeah," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "Yeah," she would repeat, the unfamiliar sound strange and beautiful on her tongue. He taught her Tu for water, Chil for a plant, Sha for the sun that governed their lives. The words were more than just sounds. They were a glimpse into his world, a world where every rock and tree had a spirit and a name. In return, she taught him hers. She found an old primer that had belonged to her as a child, its pages soft and worn, sitting by the firelight. She would point to the black marks on the page. "Hey," she said, tracing the letter with her finger. He watched her, his focus absolute, his brow furrowed in concentration. He repeated the sound, his pronunciation careful and precise. They moved from letters to simple words: sun, water, man, woman. One evening, she pointed to the word a laugh. He sounded it out slowly. "A laugh," he said, the sound foreign in his mouth. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. "It is the sound you make when your heart is happy," she explained. A rare, small smile touched the corners of his mouth. He looked down at the book, then back at her, and a low chuckle rumbled in his chest. It was a soft, unused sound, but it was real. Ellie found herself smiling back, and then a real laugh, bright and clear, escaped her lips. It was the first time she had truly laughed since her father's passing, and the sound of it, mingling with his, was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. But in a land this hard, peace was a fleeting thing, a delicate wildflower destined to be trampled. It came for them in the dead of night. They were asleep, tangled together in the warmth of the bed, when a sound from outside jerked them awake. It was the splintering of wood, followed by a chorus of drunken, ugly laughter. Nantan was out of the bed before Ellie's eyes were fully open, moving with a silent, lethal grace. He pulled on his leggings and grabbed the long knife he kept by the bedside. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice a low growl she had never heard before. "Do not make a sound." Ellie's heart hammered against her ribs. She crept to the window and peered through a crack in the curtains. 4 figures on horseback were in the yard, their forms monstrous in the moonlight. One of them was Caleb Vance. He held a flaming torch in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other. "Come on out, savage," Caleb roared. His words slurred. "We know you are in there with her. We have come to collect the white woman you stole." The other 3 men whooped and hollered, their voices filled with the vicious cruelty that only strong drink and a mob mentality can produce. One of them threw a rock, and it smashed through the kitchen window with a terrifying crash. Nantan was already gone, having slipped out the back door like a phantom. Ellie watched in frozen terror as Caleb dismounted and swaggered toward the front door, a heavy axe in his hand. "I'm going to get what is mine," he snarled. He never made it to the door. Nantan emerged from the shadows of the barn, a silent specter of vengeance. The drunken men did not see him until it was too late. He moved with a speed that was not entirely human. The first man, who was in the process of dismounting, found himself on the ground, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. A scream of agony cut short as Nantan's hand clamped over his mouth. The second man turned, fumbling for his pistol, but Nantan was already on him. There was no finesse, no heroic posturing. It was brutal, efficient, and terrifyingly swift. A flash of the knife, a choked gasp, and the man crumpled, clutching a leg that would never again hold his weight. Caleb and the last man stared, their drunken bravado evaporating into cold, sober fear. "Shoot him!" Caleb shrieked, scrambling backward. The fourth man managed to draw his gun, but his hands were shaking. He fired a wild shot that went wide, the bullet thudding into the side of the barn. In that same instant, Caleb, in his panicked retreat, stumbled backward and dropped his torch. It fell into a pile of dry hay that had been stacked near the barn door. The effect was instantaneous. The hay erupted in a whoosh of flame, the fire climbing the dry, weathered boards of the barn with a hungry roar. A scream tore from Ellie's throat, high and piercing.
"The horses!"
Inside the barn, the 2 animals began to neigh in terror, their panicked movements shaking the entire structure. The sight of the fire, the sound of her own scream, broke Ellie's paralysis. She ran from the house, grabbing buckets from the well as she went. The scene in the yard was one of chaos. Nantan had disabled the last of the attackers and was now staring at the rapidly spreading flames, his face a mask of fury. Caleb, forgotten in the mayhem, scrambled to his feet and fled into the darkness, his cowardice complete.
"The horses!"
Ellie screamed again, her voice raw with panic. Nantan did not hesitate. He plunged the barn's water trough, tipping it over and sending a wave of water against the base of the fire, then charged into the smoke-filled entrance. Ellie could hear him inside, his voice speaking in low, calming Apache words to the terrified animals. A moment later, he emerged, leading the 2 horses, their eyes wide with fear, their coats singed. He slapped their rumps, sending them galloping into the relative safety of the open pasture. Then they fought the fire. They worked together, a desperate 2-person army against the inferno. Nantan would fill the buckets at the well, his powerful arms working the pump with frantic speed, and Ellie would take them, her dress and hair soaked, and throw the water onto the flames. The smoke burned their lungs, the heat seared their skin, and the roar of the fire was a deafening monster. They fought until their muscles screamed, until their lungs felt ready to burst, until the last stubborn ember was extinguished. They stood in the aftermath, leaning against each other, gasping for breath, their faces black with soot. The fire was out, but the damage was done. A huge, blackened hole gaped in the side of the barn. Their entire winter supply of hay was gone, turned to a smoldering pile of ash. The smell of smoke and ruin hung heavy in the air. Sheriff Brody arrived the next morning, not alone, but with 2 deputies. He surveyed the scene with a cold, accusatory eye. The damaged barn, the bloodstains in the dirt, the discarded whiskey bottle. He did not ask if they were all right. "Seems you had a busy night," he said, his gaze settling on Nantan, who stood silently by the well, his arms crossed over his chest. There were fresh cuts on his hands and a dark bruise forming on his cheekbone. "We were attacked," Ellie said, her voice hoarse. She stood between the sheriff and Nantan, a small, defiant shield. "Caleb Vance and 3 other men, they were drunk. They set fire to our barn." The sheriff sighed, a long, theatrical sound of weary impatience. "Miss Granger, or whatever you call yourself now, this is what I warned you about. You bring a man like this onto your property, you are inviting trouble. He has a dispute with these men, and he settles it here, burning down your farm." The injustice of his words was a physical blow. "A dispute? He has no dispute. They came here to harm us. Caleb assaulted me in town, and Nantan protected me. This was their revenge. You are the sheriff. It is your job to arrest them, not to blame us." "Arrest them?" Brody scoffed. "On what grounds? The word of an Indian and the woman who beds with him against the word of 4 of our own citizens? Caleb Vance's father is an important man in this territory. I have already spoken to his boy. He says he and his friends were riding by, and this man here attacked them without provocation." "He is lying!" Ellie cried, her voice trembling with rage. "I saw it. They had a torch. They called him out. They were going to kill him." The sheriff's face hardened. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. "Listen to me, girl. You made your choice. You decided to cast your lot with him. And that means you have cast yourself out from our protection. You brought this trouble on yourself. The next time it happens, I will not be coming out to investigate. I will be coming out to arrest him for whatever violence follows him. Do you understand me?" Ellie stared at him, speechless. The law, the structure she had been taught to believe in, was a sham. It was a tool to protect the powerful and punish the weak. There would be no justice for them. There would only be more threats, more violence, sanctioned by the very man who wore a star on his chest. After the sheriff and his men had gone, a heavy, despairing silence settled over the farm. They spent the day clearing the debris, the charred wood and ruined hay. They did not speak. Every blackened board, every wisp of ash was a testament to their isolation. That evening, as they sat in the quiet kitchen, Nantan finally broke the silence. He was staring into the fire, but his eyes were 1,000 miles away. "I will leave," he said, his voice so low she almost did not hear him. Ellie's head snapped up. "What?" He turned to look at her, and the pain in his eyes was so deep it stole her breath. "The lawman is right. Trouble follows me. My people were hunted. I was hunted. Now you are hunted because of me. I will not be the death of you. Ellie." He was offering her an escape. He was willing to walk back into the wilderness, to be alone again, to save her from the life he had brought upon her. In that moment, all the lingering fear, all the resentment, all the shame she had ever felt about their marriage burned away, leaving only a fierce, blazing clarity. She would not lose him. She would not be a victim of Caleb's hate or the town's prejudice. She went to him, kneeling on the floor in front of his chair. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. His skin was rough beneath her palms, his face a mask of weary resolve. "You saved my life the day those outlaws came," she said, her voice shaking with the intensity of her emotion. "You saved me from Caleb in town.
You saved me from that fire last night. You have done nothing but save me since the moment I first saw you." Her grip on his face tightened. "You already saved me. Let me save you now." A flicker of surprise, of something vulnerable, crossed his features. He had spent his life fighting, surviving, but the idea of being saved, of being fought for, was a foreign concept. "We do this together," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she did not know she possessed. "We do not run, we fight." The next day was the monthly town meeting, an open forum where grievances were aired and community decisions were made. The meeting hall was crowded, a stuffy room filled with the smell of sweat and dust and self-righteousness. When Ellie and Nantan walked in, a hush fell over the crowd. The whispers followed them like rustling snakes as they took a place near the back wall. Nantan stood, silent and imposing, his presence a stark contrast to the shuffling, murmuring townsfolk. Ellie let them stare. She let them whisper. She waited until the official business was concluded, and then she walked to the front of the room, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "I have something to say," she announced, her voice clearer and louder than she expected. All eyes turned to her. Sheriff Brody, who was running the meeting, scowled. "This is not the place for personal disputes, Mrs. Granger." "This is not a personal dispute," she countered, her gaze sweeping across the faces in the crowd, curious, hostile, and a few, she thought, ashamed. "This is a community matter. It is a matter of justice." She began to speak, not as a victim pleading for help, but as a woman who had been wronged and would not be silent. "Many of you look at me and my husband, and you see something you do not understand, something you fear. You whisper behind my back. You refuse me service in your store. You call my husband a savage." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Let me tell you who my husband is. He is the man who saved my father and me from armed thieves while the rest of you arrived too late. He is the man who has worked to rebuild a farm that was turning to dust. He is a man of honor." Her eyes found Caleb Vance, who was sitting near the front, looking smug. "And let me tell you about the men you call your own. 2 nights ago, Caleb Vance and 3 of his friends came to my home. They were drunk and they were armed. They tried to burn my barn to the ground with my animals inside it." A collective gasp went through the room. Caleb jumped to his feet. "That is a lie! She is a crazy woman!" Ellie's voice cut through his protests like a knife. "It is the truth, and it was not the first time Caleb Vance has threatened me. Weeks ago, right here in this town, he laid his hands on me. He threatened me and insulted me because he could not accept that I was married. My husband had to intervene." She named the other men who had been there, her voice ringing with conviction. The room was stunned into silence. She had taken their private whispers and dragged them into the public light. She had exposed the ugliness that they had allowed to fester in their midst. Sheriff Brody's face was purple with rage. His authority had been completely undermined. "That is enough!" he roared, banging his gavel. "You are disrupting the peace. You are making wild, unsubstantiated accusations. I will have you arrested for slander. Woman!" He started to move toward her, his hand reaching for her arm. But then, a shadow fell across him. Nantan had moved from the back of the room to stand directly behind Ellie. He did not say a word. He did not draw a weapon. He simply stood to his full height, his arms crossed, and looked at the sheriff. His eyes were as hard and as cold as river stones. And in their depths, the sheriff saw a promise of violence so absolute that it made the blood drain from his face. The room went utterly quiet. No one moved. No one breathed. The confrontation hung in the air, a silent, terrifying standoff between the law of the town and the law of the wilderness. The sheriff, looking into Nantan's eyes, saw that he had lost. He slowly lowered his hand. That night, back in the quiet of their farmhouse, the bravado was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping fear. They had won the battle, but they had declared war. They lay in their bed, not speaking,
their bodies pressed close together. Ellie was curled against Nantan's side, his arm wrapped tightly around her, a solid, living shield. She could feel the steady beat of his heart against her back. They held each other in the darkness, two small figures against a hostile world, bruised but unbroken, terrified of what the dawn would bring. The confrontation at the town meeting had been a stone thrown into a still, murky pond. The ripples that spread outward were not of understanding or change, but of a cold, hardening resentment. The town did not break its silence. It turned its silence into a wall. Before, they had been objects of gossip and scorn. Now, they were ghosts, invisible and unheard. The ostracism was no longer passive. It was a formal, unified siege. Ellie felt it first. She rode to town a few days after the meeting, her supply list clutched in her hand, a fool's hope in her heart. She went to Henderson's general store, the place where she had made her stand. The bell above the door tinkled, but no one looked up. Mr. Henderson was there, counting coins at his register. He did not acknowledge her. She stood at the counter for 5 long minutes, a phantom in his presence, until the humiliation became a physical heat on her skin. Mr. Henderson, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I need flour and salt. He finished his counting, stacked the coins neatly, and then finally looked at her, his eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. We are out of flour, he said, his voice flat. And salt. I see a barrel of flour right behind you, she replied, pointing. That is spoken for, he said, and turned his back on her, beginning to wipe down a counter that was already clean. It was the same everywhere she went. The blacksmith had no nails to sell her. The feed store was fresh out of grain for her horses. The doctor, meeting her on the street, suddenly remembered an urgent call and hurried away, his face averted. They had closed ranks. The town had passed its sentence, and the punishment was to be a slow, quiet starvation. They were exiles in their own land, cut off from the world by a silent, suffocating conspiracy of hate. They were forced to rely on what the land could provide, and what Nantan's skills could wrest from it. He hunted, bringing back lean rabbits and the occasional deer. He taught her which roots were edible, which leaves could be brewed into a bitter, fortifying tea. They had a small store of dried beans and corn from the last harvest, and they rationed it with a grim discipline. But it was not enough. The work was endless, mending the barn, tending the small garden, securing the homestead, and their diet was poor. The strain began to show on Ellie first. The endless labor, the constant anxiety, and the meager food whittled away at her. A deep weariness settled into her bones, a fatigue so profound that even a full night's sleep could not touch it. She grew thin, her dress hanging loose on her frame, and dark circles appeared like bruises beneath her eyes. She ignored the dizziness that would sometimes sweep over her, the dull ache that had taken up permanent residence behind her eyes. She had to be strong. She had told Nantan she would save him, and she could not fall apart now. But the body does not heed the commands of the will forever. One morning, as she was carrying 2 buckets of water from the well, the world went gray at the edges. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She stumbled, the buckets clattering to the ground, and a wave of blackness washed over her. When she woke, she was in their bed. Nantan was beside her, pressing a cool, damp cloth to her forehead. Her skin was on fire, yet she was shivering, a deep, uncontrollable tremor racking her body. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice a dry crackle. "You have a fever," he said. His voice was calm, but she could see a fear in his eyes she had never seen before. Not when facing outlaws, not when fighting fire. It was the fear of a powerful man facing an enemy he could not fight with a knife or his fists. He tended to her for 2 days, using his knowledge of herbs to brew teas that forced a bitter sweat from her pores. But the fever did not break. She grew weaker, drifting in and out of a delirious state, haunted by fragmented dreams of her father's face and the cold, accusing eyes of the townsfolk. On the third morning, her breathing became shallow, a faint, rattling sound in her chest. Nantan knew he could not heal her. The town's doctor would not come, and she was too weak to make the journey on horseback. He made his decision with the same quiet finality with which he did everything. He wrapped her in their thickest blankets, lifted her as if she weighed nothing, and carried her out of the house. He walked. He carried her for miles across the unforgiving landscape, his stride long and steady. The sun beat down on them, and the dust rose in choking clouds around his feet, but he did not slow. Ellie, in her brief moments of lucidity, was aware of the rhythmic movement, of the strength of the arms that held her, of the vast, indifferent sky wheeling above. He was her entire world, a moving fortress of muscle and will, carrying her toward a hope she could not see. He was heading for the mountains, to a place far from the spiteful reach of the town. He knew of an old woman, a Mexican healer named Serafina, who lived alone in a hidden canyon. A woman who judged people by the nature of their sickness, not the color of their skin. It took him the better part of a day. When he finally arrived at the small, secluded adobe hut, his arms were burning with the strain, and his tunic was dark with sweat, but his steps were as sure as when he had started. Serafina, a tiny woman with a face like a dried apple and eyes as dark and knowing as the earth, took one look at Ellie's pale, still face and wordlessly opened her door. Ellie's recovery was slow. For days, she lay in a fevered haze while Serafina worked her quiet magic with foul-smelling poultices and bitter infusions of herbs. Nantan never left her side. He sat in a chair in the corner of the small, dim room, a silent, watchful guardian. He would spoon broth into her mouth when she was able to take it, and hold her hand when the shivers took her. During that time, as her fever receded and her mind began to clear, he began to speak. It started in the dead of night, when the only sounds were the crickets and the whisper of the wind. She woke to find him staring at the single candle burning on the table, his face a mask of old, deep-seated pain. "I had a brother," he said, his voice a low murmur, as if he were speaking to himself. "His name was Taza. He was younger than me. He could run faster than anyone. He said his feet had wings." He fell silent for a long time, and Ellie lay perfectly still, afraid that any movement would shatter the fragile confidence. "The soldiers came in the moon of the popping trees," he continued, his voice flat. "It was cold. The snow was deep. They came with their big guns. They said we had to go to the reservation. My father argued. He was a chief. They shot him where he stood." He paused, his jaw working silently. "There was much noise, panic. My mother grabbed my hand. And Taza's, we ran. Taza was small. He fell in the snow. I tried to pull him up, but a soldier on a horse was coming. My mother, she pushed me. 'Run,' she said. 'Live.' She went back for him." He took a ragged breath. "I hid in the rocks. I watched them. The soldier on the horse, he did not slow down. After they were gone, I went back." My mother was holding Taza. She was trying to keep him warm, but he was already gone. She looked at me. There was no life left in her eyes. She sang a death song for him, and then for herself. She closed her eyes and did not open them again. I stayed with them until the snow covered them." He fell silent. The story hung in the small room, a weight of unimaginable sorrow. Ellie could see it all: the white snow, the red blood, the small boy with wings on his feet, the mother whose love was a final, fatal act of courage. He had told her the facts, but she could feel the heart of it, the terror, the helplessness, the soul-crushing guilt of the survivor. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. They were not tears of pity. They were tears of pure, shared grief. For the brother he had lost, for the mother he had watched die, for the boy who had been left utterly alone in a world of blood and snow. The story of her own life, which had seemed so filled with hardship, felt small and insignificant next to the abyss of his loss. She reached out her hand from the bed. "Nantan," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. He turned his head slowly, his eyes dark with the ghosts of his past. "You have no one," she whispered, the truth of it a terrible, aching wound. She squeezed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Except me." He looked at their joined hands, then back at her face. For the first time, he let the mask of the stoic warrior fall away completely. She saw in his eyes not just pain, but a flicker of disbelief, of a fragile, burgeoning hope. She was not a white woman, not a burden, not a duty. She was his people now, his one. They returned to the farm a week later. Ellie still weak, but with a new, quiet strength in her eyes. The world they returned to was the same, but they were different. The bond between them had been reforged in fever and memory, and it was now unbreakable. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a sudden, fierce bite. The first snow fell in late October, a thick, wet blanket that muffled the world in silence. The cold was a constant enemy, seeping through the cracks in the walls, turning their breath to mist in the mornings. The world shrank, its boundaries defined by the warmth of their small stone fireplace. Their life became a simple, primal rhythm of survival. Each morning, Nantan would leave before dawn, a silent figure moving through the snow-dusted landscape, his bow in his hand or his traps over his shoulder. He was a master of this harsh world, reading the story of the snow in the tracks of a rabbit or the subtle disturbance that marked a grouse's hiding place. He always came back, sometimes with game, sometimes with nothing, but he always returned. Ellie's world was the fire. She became its keeper, its priestess. She kept it fed, banking the embers at night and coaxing them to life in the frozen darkness of morning. The fire was their heart, the center of their small universe, pushing back the cold and the dark. She would cook whatever he brought, stretching their meager supplies, her hands busy with the tasks of living, mending clothes, cleaning the rifle, kneading dough for their simple bread. The days were short, the nights long. They spoke little, but their silence was a deep and abiding communion. They were a self-contained unit, a tribe of two, their survival entirely dependent on one another. The hostile town, the rest of the world, might as well not have existed. One afternoon, a blizzard descended, a howling vortex of wind and snow that erased the landscape. Nantan had been out checking his trap lines. As the hours passed and the storm intensified, a cold knot of fear began to tighten in Ellie's chest. She stood at the window, peering into the swirling white chaos, praying for a glimpse of his familiar form. He returned near dusk, a dark shape materializing out of the maelstrom. He stumbled through the door, bringing a blast of frigid air with him, and collapsed to his knees, a string of rabbits falling from his hand. He was covered in snow, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion. He was shirtless. His buckskin shirt was wrapped around his left shoulder, stained a dark, ugly red. "Nantan!" she cried, rushing to his side.
"A trap,"
he grunted, the words tight with pain.
"A wolf trap, an old one, rusted."
She helped him to a chair by the fire and gently unwrapped the makeshift bandage. The wound was deep, a set of vicious, ragged gashes on the curve of his shoulder and upper arm where the steel jaws had snapped shut. It was bleeding sluggishly, the flesh already beginning to look angry and inflamed. Without a word, she went to work. She heated water on the fire, her hands moving with a purpose she did not know she possessed. She tore a clean sheet into strips for bandages. She took the bottle of whiskey she had hidden away after her father's death, the one she had sworn never to touch again, and brought it to him. "This will hurt," she said softly. He looked at the bottle, then at her, and gave a single, sharp nod. She knelt before him and began to clean the wound. His skin was cold from the snow, but his body radiated a deep, vital heat. As she worked, her fingers brushing against his bare chest. Something shifted in the air between them. This was not like tending her father's wounds. This was different. This was intimate, elemental. The clinical act of cleaning his injury became a slow, deliberate caress. She could feel the hard planes of his muscles, the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her hand. When she was done cleaning, she took a deep breath and poured the whiskey directly into the wound. He did not cry out, but his entire body went rigid, a low hiss of breath escaping through his clenched teeth. His free hand shot out and gripped her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh, not in anger, but in a desperate, involuntary reaction to the searing pain. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the flickering firelight, his grip on her arm, the raw pain on his face, the sight of his powerful, wounded body. It all conspired to ignite a spark deep inside her, a feeling that was part fear, part awe, and part of fierce, desperate desire. She finished bandaging the wound, her hands trembling slightly. When she was done, she did not move away. She remained kneeling before him, her hand still resting on his chest. He slowly relaxed his grip on her arm, but his hand moved to cover hers, pressing it against his skin. He looked down at her, his eyes dark and burning with an intensity that mirrored the storm outside. The pain had receded, replaced by something else, something raw and needful. He lowered his head, and she raised hers to meet him. Their kiss was not tender. It was fierce, almost violent, a collision of two souls who had been stripped down to their most essential selves. It was a kiss of desperation, of hunger, of a longing made unbearable by the vast, cold emptiness that surrounded them. It was the desperate affirmation of life in the face of death. He pulled her onto his lap, his good arm wrapping around her like a steel band, and deepened the kiss, his mouth claiming hers with a possessive, all-consuming urgency. She clung to him, her fingers tangling in his long, damp hair, her body molding to his. They fell to the bearskin rug before the fire, a tangle of limbs and breathless sighs. The love they made was not gentle or slow. It was a storm, as wild and as untamed as the blizzard that raged outside their walls. It was a desperate, breathless act, a frantic search for warmth and life in a world that had frozen over. The snow piled high, burying the fences, drifting up to the windowsills, isolating them completely. For weeks, they were the only two people in the world. Their life was a cycle of hunting, surviving, and a fierce, needful passion that burned brightest in the longest, darkest nights. They were no longer just survivors. They were partners in every sense of the word, their bodies and souls intertwined. Then, in the first week of March, the world began to thaw. The sun returned, its warmth a long-forgotten promise. The snow began to melt, and the brown, sleeping earth reappeared. A sense of hope, fragile and new, began to stir in Ellie's heart. They had survived. They had faced down the town, their own demons, and the worst of winter, and they were still standing. They had won. The hope was shattered by the sound of hoofbeats. Sheriff Brody rode into their yard, two grim-faced men flanking him. He did not dismount. He sat on his horse, a figure of implacable authority, and unrolled a piece of paper. "Eleanor Granger," he called out, his voice carrying the cold, official weight of the law. "By order of the territorial judge, you are hereby given notice of eviction." Ellie and Nantan came to stand on the porch, their faces set. "Eviction?" Ellie asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "This is my land. It was my father's land." The sheriff allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. "Not according to the Territorial Survey of 1872. This plot was designated as part of the Apache reservation lands. When that reservation was dissolved, the land reverted to federal territory. It was, and I quote the judge, unfit for settlement. Your father was technically a squatter, and since your current husband is an Apache, Your continued residence here is a violation of federal statute. The legal words were a meaningless jumble, a cruel trick designed for one purpose, to take everything from them. They had used the law, his own heritage, as a weapon against him, against them. Ellie felt the ground give way beneath her. After everything they had endured, after all the fighting and surviving, they were to be undone by a piece of paper, by a line drawn on a map years ago. "It never ends," she sobbed, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a cold, bottomless despair. She buried her face in Nantan's shoulder, her body shaking with the force of her grief. Nantan held her tightly, his arms a circle of unwavering strength. He stared at the sheriff over the top of her head, his face carved from stone, his eyes burning with a cold, unquenchable fire. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises," the sheriff said, rolling up the paper. He turned his horse to leave, his victory complete. Nantan let him go. He held Ellie until her sobs subsided into ragged breaths. Then he gently pushed her back, holding her by the shoulders so she had to look at him. His face was grim, but there was no despair in it. There was only a hard, diamond-bright resolve. "Then we fight," he said. The sheriff's eviction notice was not an ending. It was a declaration of a different kind of war. The despair that had crushed Ellie on the porch was a fleeting thing, a final, shuddering sob before the hardening of resolve. The town had used rocks and fire, and finally, the twisted logic of the law. They would not fight back with the same weapons. Their battle would be one of endurance, a war fought not with bullets, but with ink and wood and an unbreakable will. That night, they did not speak of surrender. By the light of a single kerosene lamp, Ellie sat at the kitchen table with a pen, a precious bottle of ink, and a stack of paper. Her hands, calloused from farm work, felt clumsy holding the delicate instrument. But as she began to write, a new kind of strength flowed through her. She was not just a farmer's daughter anymore. She was a wife, a landowner, and a woman fighting for her home. Her first letter was to the territorial governor. She wrote with a stark, formal clarity, laying out the facts like stones in a foundation. She wrote of her father, Thomas Granger, and his years of work on the homestead. She described the attack by outlaws and the failure of the local sheriff to provide timely aid. She told of Nantan's heroism, how he had saved their lives and their property, asking for nothing in return. She detailed the subsequent harassment, the assault by Caleb Vance, the arson that destroyed their barn, and the absolute refusal of Sheriff Brody to investigate or dispense justice. Finally, she wrote of the eviction, of the cruel irony of using her husband's heritage as the legal justification to drive them from the very land he had protected. She did not plead or beg. She demanded justice, appealing to the governor's duty to protect all citizens of the territory from corruption and prejudice. Her second letter was to the commander of the nearest army fort. Her approach was different. She wrote as a citizen living on the frontier, a place where the lines between civilization and chaos were thin. She described Nantan not as a former enemy, but as a man of peace, a man who had been instrumental in stopping a band of violent criminals. She painted Sheriff Brody as a man incapable of maintaining order, a man whose personal biases were a threat to the stability of the entire region. She suggested, respectfully, that the Army had an interest in ensuring that the federal law was not being manipulated by local officials to settle personal vendettas, as such actions only bred more violence and mistrust. She wrote late into the night, the scratch of her pen the only sound in the quiet house. Nantan sat across from her, cleaning his rifle, the rhythmic, metallic slide of the cleaning rod a steady counterpoint to her writing. He did not read her words, but he felt their weight. He was a man of action, of silent deeds, and this world of paper and law was foreign to him. But he saw the fierce concentration in her eyes, the determined set of her jaw, and he understood. This was her battlefield. This was her weapon, and she wielded it with the same deadly purpose with which he would draw a bow. The next morning, while Ellie rode the long miles to the nearest town with a mail service. Nantan began his own campaign. He took his axe and walked into the small patch of woods on their property. The sound of his chopping began shortly after dawn, a series of sharp, resonant cracks that echoed across the valley. It was a sound of defiance. It was the sound of a man who was not leaving. He worked with a relentless, focused energy. He felled pine trees, his powerful swing sending chips of fragrant wood flying. He stripped the branches, squared the logs, and began hauling them back to the blackened ruin of the barn. The work was monumental, the labor of many men for a single person. But he did not tire. Each swing of the axe, each heave of a heavy log, was a declaration. I am here. This is my home. You will not move me. The townsfolk heard it. Those on the nearest homesteads heard the steady, day-long rhythm of the axe. Riders on the main road would stop and stare at the solitary figure working amidst the ruins. A man single-handedly raising a new structure from the ashes of their hate. They did not understand it. They had won. The law was on their side. Yet this man, this Apache, worked as if their victory meant nothing. His endurance was an accusation, a silent testament to their injustice that was more powerful than any shouted curse. Ellie's letters were sent. Days turned into a week, then 2. No answer came. The 30-day deadline loomed, a shadow on the horizon. Doubt began to creep into the corners of Ellie's mind. She continued to work, to help Nantan with the barn, but a quiet desperation began to gnaw at her. What if the letters were never read? What if they were read and dismissed? The scribblings of a hysterical woman. The first sign of a thaw came not from a government office, but from a place she least expected it. One morning, she opened the door to find a small, cloth-wrapped bundle on the porch step. It was a loaf of freshly baked bread, still warm from the oven. There was no note. No one was in sight. But she knew. The cloth was a distinctive checkered pattern, the same kind she'd seen on the aprons worn by Martha, the wife of Reverend Michael. Ellie stood there for a long time, the warm loaf clutched in her hands, and tears filled her eyes. It was not the bread itself, but the meaning behind it. It was a crack in the wall of silence, a single quiet act of conscience in a town that had seemed to have none. Her words at the town meeting had been heard after all, a seed of shame that had taken root in at least one heart. That night, she and Nantan ate the bread with their meager meal of rabbit stew. It tasted of hope. A few days later, another offering appeared, a small sack of potatoes, left by the fence post nearest the road. The week after that, a bag of nails, the very thing the blacksmith had refused to sell her, was hanging from the handle of the well pump. The kindnesses were small, anonymous, and delivered under the cover of darkness, but they were not insignificant. They were a quiet rebellion, a confession of the town's guilt. Some of the people, it seemed, could not live with what they had done. They could not stop the law, but they could refuse to be complicit in their cruelty. Nantan watched these offerings appear with a quiet, unreadable expression. He had lived his life expecting nothing from her people but violence and betrayal. These small acts of humanity were a foreign language to him, one he did not fully trust, but he saw the effect they had on Ellie. They gave her strength. They fanned the dying embers of her hope back into a flame. With a week remaining before the eviction, Ellie knew she could not simply wait. The letters were a shot in the dark, and the anonymous gifts were not enough to save them. There was one last thing she could do. She had to face the man who had signed the order, the man who held their entire world in his hands. She put on her best dress, the same simple blue cotton she had worn at her wedding. It seemed a lifetime ago. She was not the same terrified girl. She braided her hair neatly and stood before Nantan. "I am going to see the judge," she said, her voice steady. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He saw no fear there, only a cold, hard resolve that matched his own. He did not try to stop her. He simply nodded. "I will go with you." "No," she said, placing a hand on his arm. This is a fight I must have alone. Your presence will only harden their hearts. They must see me. A woman, not an Indian's wife, but a woman of this territory, demanding justice. He did not like it. She could see the fierce, protective instinct warring in his eyes, but he respected her. He understood that this was her battle to fight, just as the barn was his. He walked with her to the horse and lifted her into the saddle. "Be careful," he said, the words a low prayer. The ride to the territorial courthouse was long. When she arrived, her body ached, but her spirit was a steel rod. The courthouse was an imposing brick building, a symbol of a power and an order that had been used against her. She walked up the steps, her boots echoing in the quiet hall, and asked a clerk to see Judge Morrison. She was made to wait for over an hour in a hard wooden chair, a deliberate act of intimidation. Finally, she was shown into his chambers. The room was dark, paneled with wood, and lined with books of law she could not read. Judge Morrison was an old man with a tired, jowly face and small, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through her. Sheriff Brody was there, standing by the window, a smug, confident look on his face. "Mrs. Granger," the judge said, his voice a dry rustle. "I have your eviction order on my desk. I assume you are here to plead for an extension. The answer is no." Ellie stood before his large desk, her hands clasped in front of her. She did not let her eyes waver from his. "I am not here to ask for more time, Your Honor. I am here to ask for justice." "Justice has been rendered," the judge said dismissively. "The law is clear." "The law," Ellie replied, her voice ringing with a passion she could no longer contain, "is also supposed to be just. Is it justice to drive a family from a home they have built with their own hands, a home they have bled to protect?" She began her story. She told him everything, her voice clear and unwavering. She told him of the outlaws, and how a lone Apache man had stood against them when the law was nowhere to be found. She held up her hands. "These hands, Your Honor, are the hands of a farmer. My husband's hands are those of a warrior, and we have both worked that land. Our land, every day." She turned her gaze on Sheriff Brody, who shifted uncomfortably. "I told this man what happened. He called me a liar. When I was publicly assaulted in town by Caleb Vance, my husband protected me. For that, Sheriff Brody accused my husband of inciting trouble when Caleb Vance and his friends came to our home in the dead of night with torches, shouting that they had come to take the white woman and set fire to our barn. Sheriff Brody took the word of a drunken coward over mine." The judge's expression began to change. The weariness was still there, but it was now mingled with a flicker of interest, of irritation. He looked from Ellie to the sheriff. "I came to the town meeting," Ellie continued, her voice rising. "I spoke the truth in front of everyone, and for that, the sheriff threatened to arrest me. For speaking the truth. So I ask you, Judge Morrison, what is the law in this territory? Is it what is written in your books, or is it simply the will of the man with the badge, a man who uses his power to protect the guilty and punish the innocent?" She took a deep breath, her heart pounding. "You say my father was a squatter, and that my husband's blood makes our presence on that land a violation. My father lived on that land and paid his taxes for 15 years. No one called him a squatter then. It is only now, when it provides a convenient excuse to punish a man for the crime of being born Apache, that this old survey is remembered. This is not about the law, Your Honor. This is about hate, and you have used the sanctity of your office to give that hate a legal seal." She fell silent. The room was thick with a tense, heavy quiet. Sheriff Brody's face was pale, his smugness gone, replaced by a look of cornered fury. Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. He stared at Ellie for a long, long time, his sharp eyes assessing her. He was a man who had seen every kind of liar, scoundrel, and fool the territory had to offer. He saw none of them in the woman standing before him. He saw a woman of grit and substance, a woman pushed to the very edge, who had come not to plead, but to fight, armed only with the truth. And he was tired. He was tired of the petty squabbles, the endless cycle of violence and retribution, the ugliness that men like Brody and Vance brought to his courtroom. "Sheriff," the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is what she says true? Did you fail to investigate the arson at her property?" "Your Honor," Brody stammered, "it was a complex situation. Their word against—" "Did you threaten to arrest her at a public meeting for speaking?" The judge cut in, his voice like ice. The sheriff's silence was his confession. Judge Morrison sighed, a deep, weary sound. He picked up the eviction order from his desk, looked at it, and then, with a decisive movement, he tore it in half, and then in half again. He dropped the pieces into his wastebasket. "The order is rescinded," he said flatly. "The Granger homestead is to be considered a legal settlement, pending a new federal survey, which I imagine will take a great many years to complete." He then fixed his cold gaze on the sheriff. "Sheriff Brody, your conduct in this matter has been a disgrace to your office. You have failed to keep the peace. You have shown gross prejudice, and you have abused your authority. I would accept your resignation, effective immediately." Sheriff Brody stared, his mouth agape, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He opened his mouth to protest, but one look from the judge silenced him. Defeated, he turned without a word and stormed out of the chambers. Caleb Vance and his family, Ellie heard later, left town within the week, unable to face the disgrace. Ellie stood, trembling with shock and relief, the strength that had held her up suddenly deserting her. "Thank you, Your Honor," she whispered. The judge simply nodded, his face weary. "Go home, Mrs. Granger," he said. "Just go home." The walk back to the farm was a long, silent journey. Nantan had been waiting for her at the edge of town, his face an impassive mask that betrayed nothing of the anxiety he must have felt. When he saw her, he simply dismounted and stood waiting. She slid down from her horse and into his arms, burying her face in his chest. He held her, and she told him everything. They walked the rest of the way, leading the horses, her hand clutched tightly in his. The sun was beginning to set, and the land, which had so often felt like an enemy, now seemed to welcome them, to embrace them. The air was cool and clean. The world felt new. They arrived home as the last rays of sunlight were painting the sky a brilliant, fiery red. The new frame of the barn stood against the horizon, a skeleton of their future, a promise of things rebuilt. They stood on the porch of their small, weathered farmhouse, the home they had almost lost, the home they had won back together. Ellie looked up at Nantan, at his strong, silent face, etched with the scars of a life she could only begin to imagine. She thought of her father, of his final, desperate command that had seemed like a curse but had been a blessing. "My father was right," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You were worth more than gold." A rare, gentle smile touched Nantan's lips. He pulled her into his arms, his embrace both fierce and tender. He held her close, his cheek resting against the top of her head, and looked out at the vast, beautiful, and unforgiving land that was their home. "You are my people now," he said softly. The sun sank below the edge of the canyon, leaving the sky ablaze with color. They stood there for a long time, holding each other close. Two solitary figures against the immense landscape, bruised but, finally, unbroken. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, subscribe to the From Wild West channel, and please share your thoughts with us in English.